It started as the perfect summer. The kind of summer where the days stretch endlessly, the sunlight paints every corner of your yard in warm gold, and the sound of splashing water becomes the rhythm of your afternoons. I had spent the spring building a backyard oasis that I had dreamed of for years. A modest pool, a small deck lined with string lights, and comfortable chairs where family and friends could gather. It wasn't extravagant, just something that felt like a reward after years of saving and working. But perfection has a way of drawing attention, and in neighborhoods governed by homeowners associations, or overshadowed by neighbors who believe they own the rules, that attention is rarely positive. My attention came in the form of a woman who lived 2 houses down, someone who had already earned a reputation in whispers across the street. Her name was Linda, though most called her Karen, not because of her actual name, but because of her behavior. She carried herself like an enforcer, someone who believed the street was her kingdom, and everyone else was just a trespasser. At first, I thought she would be harmless. She gave me long stares when I was setting up the deck, lingering looks whenever the contractors came in to finish the pool. But I brushed it off, believing that not everyone had to be friendly, and that neighbors sometimes just kept to themselves. Still, those looks weren't just curiosity, they were judgments, assessments, silent accusations. And as the pool filled with water for the first time, I could almost sense the tension tightening like a rope across the street. The first pool party was small. Just family. Laughter, the sound of kids splashing, music playing low from a portable speaker. I kept the volume respectful, because I knew how quickly noise could carry in suburban streets. By the time the sun set and the lights flickered on, I felt proud, not just of the pool, but of the life I had built. Yet that pride was interrupted when I noticed a figure standing across the street, arms crossed, phone in hand. Linda. She didn't say a word, but her message was clear, she was watching, waiting. I convinced myself it was nothing, but neighbors like her never leave things at silent threats. By the second gathering, a weekend barbecue with a few friends, she had escalated. The moment laughter rose above the fence, the phone came out. Not to call a friend, not to check messages, but to dial the non-emergency line of the police department. She stood there in her yard like a sentry, reporting a noise complaint while the smell of grilled food drifted through the air. The police arrived that evening, 2 officers walking through the gate with polite smiles. They told me they'd received a complaint, that they were required to check in. They measured the volume, glanced around at the family-friendly scene, and gave me a shrug. "You're fine," they said, apologizing for the interruption. I thought that would be the end of it. But for people like Linda, being told no only fueled their determination to find another yes. The following week, the complaints multiplied. She began calling not just during parties, but even on weekdays when no one was in the pool. One Tuesday afternoon, while I was at work, I got a call from the police saying a neighbor had reported dangerous gatherings at my address. When they arrived, they found an empty backyard. No music. No guests. Just an overzealous neighbor trying to wield authority she didn't have. It became clear this wasn't about noise. This was about control. She didn't like that my home had become a place of joy, that people were choosing to gather there, and that her self-appointed role as neighborhood enforcer was being undermined. Every splash of water, every sound of laughter, was, to her, an insult. And so, she turned to escalation. By the time July rolled around, the situation reached its breaking point. On one particularly hot Saturday, I hosted the largest party yet. Friends, cousins, neighbors from the other end of the street, all gathered to enjoy the pool. Music played, grills smoked, drinks chilled in ice buckets. It wasn't reckless, but it was lively, the kind of scene summer memories are built on. And then, of course, she made her move. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Linda stormed across the street. Her phone was pressed to her ear, her voice raised as she shouted into it, pointing wildly at my house as though she were calling in an emergency raid. Minutes later, police cars pulled into the neighborhood. Their lights flashed against the fences, their presence drawing every eye to the street. Linda stood proudly at the curb, waiting for her victory, certain that this was the moment she would shut me down once and for all. She waved the officers toward my yard like she was directing traffic, confident that her persistence had finally paid off. But what she didn't know, what none of us knew yet, was that the very call she made would unravel everything. Because when the police arrived, they didn't just see a pool party. They saw something else. Something that didn't belong to me. Something that would turn the spotlight onto her. The officers approached politely, checking the volume, confirming again that nothing illegal was happening on my property. Then, as they prepared to leave, one officer glanced across the street. His eyes lingered on Linda's home, and he frowned. The lights strung across her roof were not up to code. The extension cords ran haphazardly through her yard, tangled and dangerous. A backyard shed leaned precariously against the fence, clearly built without permits. The officer's frown deepened. And in that moment, the balance shifted. Linda had drawn the battle lines, but she had forgotten one crucial detail: when you invite authority into a neighborhood, they don't only look at one house. They look at everything. And Linda's house was a treasure chest of violations. That evening, the officers didn't just leave me alone. They crossed the street. They started asking questions. They started taking notes. And Linda, who had marched out expecting triumph, suddenly found herself cornered by the very people she had called for backup. What unfolded next was the beginning of a downfall no one could have predicted. And it all started with that one phone call. The night the police crossed the street marked the beginning of something none of us expected. What was supposed to be just another noise complaint turned into a spotlight shining directly onto Linda's property. At first, the officers simply noted a few things: tangled cords, questionable structures, unsafe lighting. But as their flashlights moved over her yard, they found more. A shed that leaned as though a single storm could bring it down. An above-ground pool partially hidden by tarps, filled with murky water that hadn't been maintained. Piles of lumber stacked against the house without covering, perfect breeding grounds for pests. The officers didn't act aggressively, they simply documented. Clipboards came out, photographs were taken, and questions were asked. Linda, who had expected to be praised for her community vigilance, suddenly found herself on the defensive. Her voice rose, sharp and panicked, as she insisted she was the one who called, that she was the victim, that her neighbors' parties were out of control. But the officers didn't bite. They had a job to do, and her property was speaking louder than her words. I watched from across the street, stunned. My guests fell silent as the scene unfolded, their laughter replaced with whispers. The same police who had come to shut me down were now walking through Linda's yard with flashlights, pointing out hazard after hazard. It was almost surreal, like the universe had flipped the script in real time. The next morning, the neighborhood buzzed. Word had spread quickly, as it always does in communities where every detail becomes a story. Neighbors who had once stayed neutral now whispered with a sense of satisfaction. They, too, had suffered under Linda's constant complaints and meddling. Many had been reported for trivial things: grass too long, trash cans left out an extra hour, holiday decorations lingering past January. She had positioned herself as the unofficial sheriff of the block, but now, her own fortress was crumbling. And it wasn't just gossip. Within a week, inspectors arrived. Not just once, but multiple times. The city had been notified, and code enforcement officers began their rounds. They looked at property lines, at permits, at safety codes. They asked to see documentation for the shed, the pool, and the deck that had mysteriously appeared in her backyard years ago. None of it, as it turned out, had ever been filed legally. Linda's fury grew with every visit. She stormed into meetings with the inspectors, waving her arms, insisting that she was being targeted. But the truth was unavoidable: the very system she had weaponized against her neighbors was now holding her accountable. Each violation carried fines. Each fine added up. And as the paperwork stacked higher, so did the tension. Still, she didn't back down. Instead of quietly addressing the issues, Linda doubled down on her crusade against me. She believed that if she could prove my gatherings were disruptive, it would somehow offset her own problems. Every weekend, without fail, she stood at her window or lingered at her fence, phone ready, eyes locked on my yard. Calls to the police didn't stop, if anything, they intensified. But by then, the officers knew the routine. They arrived, checked, found nothing unlawful, and left. The more it happened, the less credibility she had. It was during one of these visits that the true turning point arrived. An officer, now familiar with both my address and hers, mentioned offhandedly that her property had been flagged for further investigation. They didn't elaborate, but the look on Linda's face said everything. The walls were closing in, and for the first time, she seemed to realize it. The neighborhood, however, wasn't sympathetic. In fact, people began to speak up. Stories emerged about how she had harassed others over the years, how she had intimidated new homeowners, how she had even reported a single mother for leaving chalk drawings on the sidewalk with her child. Every person she had wronged now had reason to celebrate her downfall. It wasn't just me anymore, it was the entire block watching karma play out in real time. As the weeks passed, the inspections uncovered more than anyone anticipated. Electrical wiring in her garage was dangerously outdated and illegally installed. A makeshift addition to the back of her house violated multiple safety codes. Even her fencing encroached beyond the legal property line, something she had accused me of doing months earlier. The list of violations was no longer a nuisance, it was a mountain. One evening, as the sun set and I relaxed by the pool in quiet satisfaction, I noticed something unusual. A city vehicle pulled into her driveway, and two officials stepped out with thick folders in hand. They weren't there for casual checks anymore, this was serious. They spent nearly an hour walking through the property, taking photographs, asking pointed questions. By the time they left, Linda was pacing her yard in circles, shouting into her phone, her voice trembling with anger and fear. That night, the whispers turned into certainty, eviction was on the horizon. Her house wasn't just non-compliant, it was unsafe. And when a property becomes unsafe, the city has no choice but to act. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The woman who had spent years dictating how others should live, who had tried to dismantle my summer with endless complaints, now stood at risk of losing everything. Her castle of control had turned into a liability. But the story didn't end there. Because when people like Linda feel cornered, they don't retreat quietly. They fight, even when the fight is already lost. And her next move would drag the neighborhood into chaos one last time before her fate was sealed. The summer that began with laughter was about to turn into a showdown, one that would test how far Linda was willing to go, and how much the community was willing to endure. By midsummer, the weight of Linda's violations had become impossible to ignore. Fines arrived in the mail like clockwork, piling higher with each passing week. Notices from the city warned of mandatory corrections. And though she tried to hide the letters by snatching them from her mailbox quickly, the tension was obvious. Neighbors could see it in the way she slammed doors, in the way her once proud lawn grew ragged, in the way her voice echoed late into the night during phone calls no one wanted to overhear. But Linda was not the type to surrender. If anything, the mounting pressure made her more aggressive. Instead of quietly fixing her property, she launched a campaign of retaliation, a desperate counterattack meant to shift attention away from her and back onto me. She was convinced that if she could paint me as the villain, the authorities would ease their grip on her. Her first move was subtle but malicious. Anonymous complaints began surfacing online, targeting my address. False claims of illegal construction, unlicensed gatherings, and even accusations that I was renting out my home for parties. At first, I didn't realize they came from her. The reports were written under fake names, but the language was unmistakable. The same tone, the same exaggerated phrasing, the same obsession with control. It was Linda in disguise, trying to stir trouble from behind a screen. When those attempts failed, she grew bolder. Flyers appeared on mailboxes, criticizing loud parties and unsafe behavior on my property. The papers were stuffed into envelopes without return addresses, but neighbors weren't fooled. Everyone knew who was behind them. The irony, of course, was that her own house was the one flagged as unsafe, and yet she was spending her energy spreading lies about me. The real breaking point came one humid Saturday evening. I had decided to keep the pool quiet that weekend, inviting only a couple of close friends. The night was calm, the music low, nothing that could even remotely be considered disruptive. And yet, at precisely 9 p.m., the flashing lights of a police cruiser appeared once again. Linda had called in another complaint. But this time, something was different. Instead of simply checking the volume and leaving, the officers informed me that they had received multiple reports of illegal activities at my residence. Someone had claimed I was charging admission for parties, that alcohol was being sold, that the gatherings were dangerous. It was an escalation far beyond simple noise complaints. The officers, though professional, couldn't hide their skepticism. They had been to my home enough times to know the truth. Still, they were obligated to investigate, and for the next half hour, they inspected my backyard, questioned my guests, and verified that nothing unlawful was happening. When they finally left, their frustration was clear. "This has to stop," one of them muttered as he walked out. And while the officers left me in peace, they didn't leave the neighborhood altogether. Instead, they crossed the street once again. Linda, who had been standing proudly at her fence waiting for my downfall, suddenly found herself on the receiving end of stern questions. The officers explained that false reports were a serious offense, that her pattern of harassment was now on record, and that further misuse of emergency services could result in charges. The look on her face that night was unforgettable, a mixture of shock, rage, and humiliation. She had tried to weaponize the system, and now the system was beginning to turn on her. Still, she didn't stop. If anything, her tactics grew more frantic. She attempted to rally support from the neighborhood, knocking on doors, trying to convince others to sign petitions against me. But instead of finding allies, she found closed doors. The same people she had antagonized for years wanted nothing to do with her crusade. Some even laughed in her face, reminding her of the long list of violations on her own property. Her isolation became obvious. Where she once walked the street with confidence, now she scurried quickly from her car to her house, avoiding eye contact. Curtains stayed drawn, lights flickered late at night, and the sound of heated phone calls leaked through her windows. It was clear she was trying to fight battles on multiple fronts, with the city, with inspectors, with neighbors, and with her own unraveling reputation. The city, meanwhile, continued its pressure. Fines escalated into formal notices. Notices escalated into warnings of forced action. The shed was deemed hazardous and scheduled for removal. The unsafe wiring was ordered to be corrected or disconnected. And the unpermitted addition to the back of her house became the subject of legal review. Each new development tightened the noose. Yet Linda's pride wouldn't allow her to admit defeat. She told anyone who would listen, which by now was almost no one, that she was being targeted unfairly, that she was the victim of a conspiracy led by me. She clung to that narrative like a lifeline, even as the evidence stacked against her. The final straw came when inspectors returned with law enforcement at their side. This wasn't just a casual check anymore, it was a formal intervention. They documented every violation, issued a final round of fines, and delivered the warning she had dreaded most: if corrections weren't made immediately, her property would be condemned. Eviction wasn't just a rumor anymore. It was a looming reality. That evening, the neighborhood gathered quietly in small groups, whispering about what they had witnessed. Some pitied her, others celebrated, but everyone understood the gravity of what was unfolding. The woman who had terrorized the block with her complaints, who had tried to dismantle my summer with false reports, now stood on the edge of losing her home. From my yard, I watched the sunset reflect off the pool water, the laughter of my friends soft in the background. For the first time in weeks, I felt peace. The storm was still raging across the street, but it wasn't mine to weather anymore. Still, I knew it wasn't over. Linda was cornered, and cornered people are unpredictable. She had one last chance to make her move, one final opportunity to lash out before the city sealed her fate. And if history had taught me anything, it was that she wouldn't go down quietly. The real showdown was yet to come. By the end of July, the tension in the neighborhood felt like a storm cloud hanging over every house. Conversations grew hushed whenever Linda's name came up, as if saying too much might summon her wrath. Everyone was waiting for the inevitable breaking point, the moment when her defiance would clash directly with the weight of the city's enforcement. That moment came sooner than expected. Linda's desperation had been building. Weeks of fines, inspections, and warnings had left her furious, humiliated, and isolated. And though she could no longer rely on the neighborhood for support, she still clung to the belief that she could fight her way out. If she couldn't win legally, she would try theatrically. She would make one last stand, and she decided her battleground would be my backyard. It started on a Saturday afternoon, the kind of day made for summer gatherings. My pool shimmered under the sun, the smell of grilled food drifted through the air, and the laughter of children echoed off the fences. It was everything Linda hated: joy, community, and the reminder that her attempts to ruin it had failed. As the party settled into its rhythm, Linda struck. She marched out of her house carrying a stack of papers, waving them in the air like weapons. She stormed to the edge of my property, shouting accusations loud enough for the entire street to hear. She claimed she had legal documents proving my pool was a hazard, that I was violating HOA rules, that the city was about to shut me down. But her performance didn't have the impact she imagined. Neighbors gathered at their porches, not to support her, but to watch the spectacle unfold. Her papers flapped in the wind, revealing themselves to be nothing more than photocopied printouts, outdated codes and half-legible complaints she had likely drafted herself. Her voice cracked under the weight of frustration, her accusations tumbling out faster than her logic could support them. Then came the moment that shifted everything. 2 city vehicles pulled onto the street, followed by a police cruiser. Officials stepped out, carrying clipboards and folders. But they didn't come to my house. They walked straight to hers. The crowd that had formed along the sidewalks fell silent. Everyone watched as the inspectors approached Linda's property, ignoring her outburst entirely. She turned in confusion, her voice faltering as she tried to redirect their attention toward me. But the officials didn't even glance my way. Their mission was clear: this visit was for her. The officers explained that her deadline had expired. The violations she had ignored, the hazards she had refused to correct, had left the city with no choice. Her property was officially being condemned. The words hung heavy in the air, echoing louder than any of her complaints ever had. Linda's face drained of color. For years, she had thrived on control, on dictating how others should live. Now that control was slipping through her fingers in front of the entire neighborhood. She shouted, pleaded, demanded explanations, but the officials remained calm, pointing to the paperwork that documented every violation. The truth was undeniable: her house was unsafe, her additions illegal, and her refusal to comply had sealed her fate. Neighbors whispered among themselves, some shaking their heads, others smirking at the irony. Here was the woman who had reported people for leaving trash cans out an extra hour, now facing eviction because her entire property was in shambles. Karma wasn't just poetic, it was public. But Linda wasn't ready to surrender. As the officials moved to post the bright orange notice on her door, she made her final desperate attempt. She stormed back to my fence, screaming that this was all my fault. She accused me of conspiring with the city, of turning everyone against her, of orchestrating a grand plan to steal her home. Her words were wild, her gestures frantic, her desperation plain for all to see. For a moment, I almost felt pity. Almost. But then I remembered the endless calls to the police, the false reports, the way she had tried to dismantle my peace. She had written her own downfall, line by line, action by action. The officers finally intervened, guiding her back to her yard. She resisted, her voice echoing through the street, but resistance didn't matter anymore. The notice went up on her door, a bright marker of reality. She had lost. The crowd began to disperse slowly, neighbors returning to their homes with stories they would tell for years. My guests, though shaken by the drama, settled back into the party, their laughter cautious at first but growing freer as the sun dipped below the horizon. The storm had finally broken, and though Linda's rage still echoed across the street, the outcome was already decided. That night, the neighborhood was quieter than it had been in months. No more shouting from Linda's yard, no more police cars pulling in for false alarms. Just the hum of crickets and the soft ripple of water in the pool. But even in the quiet, I knew it wasn't over. Linda still had a few days before she would be forced out. And knowing her, she wouldn't go peacefully. The real test wasn't whether she would leave, it was how much chaos she would unleash before she did. The showdown had reached its climax, but the fallout was still to come. And in the final days of her reign, Linda would make sure the entire neighborhood felt the weight of her collapse. Once the orange eviction notice was nailed to Linda's door, the neighborhood began counting down. The paper was more than just a warning, it was a timer, ticking away the final days of her hold over the street. And while most people would have used that time to quietly pack, to salvage what they could of their dignity, Linda chose another path. She decided that if she was going down, she would go down swinging. The first sign came the very next morning. Instead of retreating into silence, she blasted music from her house, a screeching mix of old rock songs that carried down the block. It wasn't celebration, it was defiance. The volume was so loud that windows rattled. Neighbors called the police, but when officers arrived, she turned it down just enough to avoid a citation, only to crank it back up once they left. It was her way of saying she still had control, even as that control slipped away. Then came the yard. She began dragging items out of her house, broken furniture, old appliances, boxes filled with who knew what, and scattering them across the lawn. It looked less like moving and more like chaos. Neighbors watched in disbelief as piles grew taller each day, until her front yard resembled a junkyard. Some speculated it was a tactic, an attempt to make the block look as miserable as possible before her departure. Others whispered that she had simply lost her grip on reality. But the most unnerving part was how she treated the neighborhood itself. She started walking the street at night, muttering to herself, sometimes stopping in front of houses and glaring at the windows. She left angry notes on porches, accusing people of betrayal, of siding with me, of conspiring against her. The paranoia that had always fueled her behavior was now fully unmasked. By midweek, the police were back, not because of my pool, but because of her. Neighbors reported shouting matches, late-night disturbances, and even threats. Officers tried to reason with her, reminding her that her time was almost up, but reasoning with Linda had never worked before and wasn't going to work now. She ranted about conspiracies, about corruption, about how the entire block was out to get her. To her, the eviction notice wasn't the result of her violations, it was evidence of a plot. Meanwhile, the neighborhood began to change. There was a strange sense of relief mixed with tension, like watching storm clouds finally break apart. Neighbors who had once stayed quiet now spoke openly, sharing stories of how Linda had harassed them over the years. A retired couple admitted she had threatened to report them for painting their shutters the wrong shade of green. A family confessed she had filed complaints about their teenage son parking his car too close to her driveway. Each story added another layer to the collective realization, her downfall wasn't just justice for me, it was justice for everyone. But Linda wasn't finished. On the second-to-last night before her eviction deadline, she staged her boldest move yet. Around midnight, the sound of hammering echoed through the street. Lights flicked on in windows as neighbors peered out to see Linda in her yard, pounding makeshift boards over her windows and doors. She shouted that she wasn't leaving, that no one could force her out, that her home was her fortress. Sparks flew as she tried to reinforce her shed with chains and locks, as if bracing for a siege. The police were called once again. This time, they didn't come with polite reminders or warnings. They came with authority. They explained, firmly, patiently, but without room for argument, that the eviction was not optional. The house was condemned, and no amount of hammering, chaining, or shouting could change that. The scene was surreal. Flashing lights bathed the street, neighbors gathered in small clusters, whispering as officers tried to calm Linda. She screamed at them, screamed at me, screamed at anyone who would listen. Her voice was raw, her fury absolute. And yet, beneath it all, there was something else, fear. The woman who had spent years terrorizing others was finally facing consequences she couldn't outrun, and it terrified her. By dawn, the boards were half removed, the chains cut, the street quiet again. Linda retreated into her house, slamming the door shut, and for the first time in years, the neighborhood exhaled. Everyone knew what was coming next. The final day arrived like the closing act of a play. The city trucks rolled in, officials stepped out with documents in hand, and law enforcement stood by to ensure compliance. This wasn't another warning or inspection, this was the end. Linda, however, still believed she could fight. She emerged from her house with suitcases piled at her feet, insisting she was only temporarily leaving, that the city would reverse its decision once they realized their mistake. But her words carried no weight anymore. The officials read the orders, the notice was finalized, and her property was declared uninhabitable. As her belongings were loaded into a car, the neighborhood gathered once more. No one cheered, but the silence carried its own statement. People had suffered under her watch for too long to feel pity, but they weren't cruel enough to celebrate. Instead, they simply watched, bearing witness to the end of an era. Linda left that afternoon, her car packed, her eyes burning with resentment as she glanced at each house she passed. When she reached mine, she slowed, glaring for a long moment before driving off. It wasn't victory she carried with her, it was bitterness, a refusal to admit that her own actions had led her here. The house stood empty now, its windows dark, its door marked with the notice that had brought her reign to an end. But even in her absence, the block felt the weight of her presence lingering. Her final days had left scars, and the neighborhood wondered what would become of the house, and whether peace would truly return. As for me, I sat by the pool that evening, the water shimmering in the golden light of sunset. The laughter of friends drifted through the air, unbothered, free. For the first time all summer, there were no interruptions, no flashing lights, no angry shouts across the street. Just peace. But while Linda was gone, her story wasn't finished. Rumors swirled about lawsuits she planned to file, about complaints she had left behind, about the possibility of her return. And as I looked across the street at the darkened house, I couldn't shake the feeling that the saga wasn't truly over. Because people like Linda don't disappear quietly. They linger, even in absence. And the final chapter of this story was still waiting to be written. When Linda's car finally disappeared around the corner, dragging her chaos with it, the neighborhood stood in stunned silence. It was as though everyone was waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the blaring music to return, for another call to the police, for some last act of defiance. But nothing came. Her house sat still, abandoned, with the bright orange eviction notice taped firmly to the door, fluttering faintly in the breeze. For the first time in years, there was quiet. Real quiet. That weekend, the change was almost immediate. Neighbors who had once lived in fear of Linda's wrath began stepping outside again. Lawns were mowed without anxiety, children played on the sidewalks without parents nervously glancing across the street, and the block felt alive in a way it hadn't in ages. One by one, people began to share relief in small gestures, a smile, a wave, a conversation by the mailbox. It was as though Linda's departure had broken an invisible chain that had held everyone hostage. Her house, however, stood as a reminder. The yard was littered with what she hadn't bothered to take: broken chairs, rusting tools, and piles of trash. Windows were still half covered with makeshift boards, the shed out back chained and locked. It looked less like a home and more like a monument to stubbornness. The city scheduled a cleanup, but until then, the property remained frozen in the state Linda had left it. Rumors swirled like wine through dry leaves. Some said Linda had moved in with relatives a few towns over. Others claimed she was plotting a legal battle, determined to reclaim her house through lawsuits and complaints. A few even whispered she might return under cover of night, slipping back into the property to reassert control. The stories varied, but one truth lingered: even gone, she still haunted the block. For me, the pool became a symbol. That summer, it was used more than ever before. Barbecues, birthday parties, small gatherings of friends and neighbors, all happened without interference. The sound of laughter carried down the street, echoing off houses that had once been silent under Linda's watch. Every splash in the water, every cheer of joy, felt like defiance against the years of intimidation. And yet, beneath the celebrations, I couldn't shake a small, persistent unease. Because Linda was not the kind of person to accept defeat quietly. Sure enough, within weeks, letters began appearing in mailboxes. Typed, unsigned, but unmistakably her work. They were filled with accusations, claims that the city had acted illegally, that neighbors had lied, that conspiracies had stolen her property. She warned that justice would be served, and that she would return what was taken. The letters weren't just words, they were promises. Promises of more conflict, more trouble, more drama to come. Most neighbors laughed them off. Some rolled their eyes, tossed the papers into trash cans, and carried on with their lives. But for me, each letter was a reminder of the war we had fought, and the possibility that it wasn't truly finished. As weeks turned into months, though, the neighborhood began to heal. The city finally cleared the junk from Linda's lawn, cut the grass, and boarded the house properly. The shed was broken open, the chains removed, and the entire property secured. Slowly, it began to look less like a battleground and more like an opportunity. Rumors spread that the house would be sold, that a new family might move in, that fresh life could take root where so much bitterness had grown. And when the "for sale" sign finally appeared, it felt like closure. People stopped on their walks just to stare at it, as if confirming for themselves that Linda's reign was truly over. Some even joked about buying the place, though most agreed it needed more repairs than they could stomach. Still, the idea of new neighbors, friendly ones, hopefully, sparked a sense of optimism that hadn't been felt on that block in years. For me, the change was personal. Hosting pool parties no longer carried the shadow of fear, no longer felt like an act of rebellion. It was simply life, lived freely. And with each gathering, I noticed more neighbors joining in, the retired couple, the family with the teenage son, even people who had once stayed completely hidden. Community, the very thing Linda had tried so hard to suppress, was blossoming stronger than ever. But Linda's story didn't fade entirely. Every so often, someone would spot her car in town, parked outside a grocery store or idling near a gas station. She never stopped, never spoke, but the sightings were enough to remind us that she was still out there, watching. The letters slowed, then stopped, but the memory of them lingered. And so, life settled into a new rhythm. The block was no longer defined by fear of one woman's control, but by the resilience of the people who had endured it. Her downfall had been dramatic, messy, and unforgettable, but in the end, it had brought something valuable: unity. The neighbors, once isolated by intimidation, had found strength in each other. As summer turned to fall, I often sat by the pool in the cool evenings, reflecting on everything that had happened. The story had begun with a simple noise complaint, a petty attempt by Linda to ruin my fun. But it had ended with her own house condemned, her reputation destroyed, and her power gone. And perhaps that was the greatest irony of all. She had tried to silence the neighborhood, to enforce control through fear and manipulation. But in the end, it wasn't my pool party that brought her down, it was herself. Her arrogance, her stubbornness, her refusal to live by the same rules she demanded of others. Her downfall wasn't just poetic justice. It was inevitable. Because sometimes, the louder someone tries to control the world around them, the more deafening their own collapse becomes. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden light across the quiet, peaceful street, I realized something important. The neighborhood wasn't haunted anymore. It was free.